You weren't just another name on the roster, just another body filling a uniform. That's what they told themselves when they saw her step onto the range that morning. To them, she was background, unimportant, a late-20s woman standing where only legends belonged. They didn't see the long nights she had spent rehearsing in silence, or the scars that didn't sit on her skin but deep in her memory. They didn't notice the steadiness in her breath, the way her hands moved with the precision of someone who had been here before, years before, in moments no one ever wrote about. They looked at her and saw a rookie. She knew better. And before I go further, if you agree that respect isn't given because of rank, medals, or the loudest voice in the room, but because of what a person carries when no one else is watching, then make sure to like and subscribe. Because what happened next, on that cracked stretch of concrete under the wide blue sky, was proof that respect has a way of walking back into the room, even when everyone has forgotten its name. The morning started with laughter, the kind of easy, careless laughter young recruits use when they're not sure where to place their nerves. The range smelled of dust and oil, gunpowder faint in the air from the last cycle of shooters. She tightened the strap on her sling and adjusted the stock against her shoulder, and that was all it took. But she won't even hit paper, one private muttered, smirking as though he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. Another leaned back against the bench, arms folded. Probably here to pose for the photo op Instagram Marine. #hero. The chuckles spread like wildfire. Boots scuffed against the ground. Rifles clinked against metal racks. Nobody said it to her face, but they didn't need to. The tone, the glances, the rolling eyes, it was enough. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. Her focus stayed on the weapon in her hands, fingers moving with deliberate patience. She'd heard it before, in different voices, in different places. And every time, she had learned the same lesson. Let silence do its work. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the concrete, throwing hard shadows beneath the bleachers. A gust of wind tugged at the targets in the distance, paper sheets flapping like restless wings. Around her, the chatter built. Stories of who hit what last week, who bragged the loudest, who had the steadiest trigger finger. Their words filled the air with noise, but underneath it all she stood calm. The one presence on the line that didn't need to raise its volume. The Gunnery Sergeant made his entrance the way veterans always do, not with noise, but with weight. His boots struck the ground in rhythm, each step measured, each glance sharp enough to cut through the bravado. The recruits straightened instinctively, though some tried to disguise it as casual confidence. He carried the roster under his arm, papers creased from too many hands and too many drills. He moved down the line slowly, pausing here and there, correcting posture, snapping at someone whose safety discipline slipped, nodding once at another who showed promise. His voice was low, steady, carrying authority without needing to shout. Then he stopped, not at the loudest, not at the cockiest, not at the ones who had been laughing. He stopped in front of her. She felt his shadow fall across her, heavy as the range went still. The chatter died mid-sentence. A bird called somewhere beyond the fence line. The world narrowed to the Gunnery Sergeant's eyes scanning the page, then lifting slowly toward her face. He read her name once, lips moving without sound. Then again, slower this time. The silence stretched long enough that recruits shifted in their boots, restless, confused. Why was he staring at her? Why linger on her name? And then he spoke, his voice clear enough to roll across the entire line. "Tempest Arrow," he said. The words cut through the air like a command, like a memory. His gaze didn't leave her. Range leader. The laughter dried instantly. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the noise. The recruits who had been smirking moments before suddenly felt the weight of the phrase, though they didn't yet understand it. The older Marines, the few instructors standing off to the side, stiffened visibly. One of them drew in a sharp breath, his head snapping toward her with wide eyes. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just met the Gunnery Sergeant's stare with the same steady silence she'd carried all morning, because she knew what they were just beginning to suspect. The recruits shuffled uncomfortably, whispering to each other now instead of laughing. "Tempest Arrow? What's that mean? Why'd he call her that? Is that a code name?" The Gunnery Sergeant finally looked away, but not in dismissal. It was a nod, almost imperceptible, of recognition. He turned to face the line. "You don't know who stands beside you," he said evenly, "until the past reminds you." The recruit said nothing. Their earlier bravado shrank into uneasy silence. She adjusted her sling again, her hands calm, her eyes fixed on the target ahead. To them it looked like just another morning of drills. But in that one phrase, Tempest Arrow, range leader, the ground had shifted. Because names carry stories. And some names, when spoken by the right voice, carry entire legacies. She was no rookie, no background face, no Instagram Marine. She was a page in a history they hadn't read yet, a story they hadn't earned the right to laugh at. And before the day ended, they would understand exactly why. But for now, the silence held, heavy and unbroken, as she prepared to fire the first shot of the morning. And somewhere in that silence, every one of them began to wonder, not who she was, but who they had just mocked, and what it meant that the Gunnery Sergeant himself had spoken her name with reverence. She raised her weapon slowly, movements practiced, precise, the same way she had hundreds of times before. To anyone else, it looked routine, just another shooter preparing to fire on the range. But the silence that wrapped around her wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the silence of discipline or concentration. It was the silence of unease, of a room full of people suddenly realizing they might have underestimated the wrong person. The Gunnery Sergeant's words still hung in the air like a flag no one dared touch. Tempest Arrow, range leader. The recruits shifted, some glancing at each other in confusion, others pretending they hadn't heard, though the tremor in their posture betrayed them. They'd been laughing at her minutes ago. Now they were second-guessing whether they even understood who they were standing beside. The sergeant didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. Veterans rarely wasted breath where silence spoke louder. He simply kept moving down the line, correcting grips and angles. But his glance returned to her every few moments, sharp and deliberate, like he was watching something only he recognized. The others whispered under their breath, their bravado cracking. "What's Tempest Arrow?" one muttered. "Some nickname, maybe?" Another offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Nah, that wasn't a nickname. Did you hear how he said it?" They were right. It hadn't been said casually. It had been said with weight. And in the military, weight always meant history. The first round of fire began. Brass casings clattered against the ground, echoing across the concrete. Shouts of correction, the snap of rifles, the sharp odor of gunpowder filling the air. Targets rippled in the wind, punctured by stray shots, uneven clusters, some barely hitting paper at all. The recruits grinned at each other when they managed a halfway decent grouping. They bragged, they cursed, they elbowed one another. And through it all, she waited. Her turn came near the end. She stepped forward without a word, adjusted her stance, and set her sights down range. The laughter had dwindled, replaced with something quieter, skepticism tangled with curiosity. They didn't want to admit it, but they wanted to see if the silence around her was deserved. Her finger tightened on the trigger. One shot cracked the air. The target fluttered. A perfect hit. A second. Another center. A third. Then a fourth. Every round walked straight into the bullseye, like it had been waiting there for her. The range went quiet again, not because silence was demanded, but because it had been taken. The recruits stared at the holes in the paper, each one stacked so close it looked like a single tear through the target's center. The Gunnery Sergeant nodded once, subtle, the kind of gesture only those who knew how to look would notice. "Group complete," he said. No one laughed. One of the louder privates coughed into his hand, shuffling his boots like maybe if he moved enough, he could escape the shame pressing down on him. Another kept his eyes fixed on his own target, unwilling to acknowledge what everyone else had seen. And then the Gunnery Sergeant did something no one expected. He called the ceasefire, ordered weapons safe, and told the recruits to hold position. His boots struck the ground as he crossed back in front of her, stopping just close enough that the others couldn't ignore it. "You know why I called you that, don't you?" he asked, his voice pitched low, but the kind of low that carried across the entire range. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The sergeant turned his head, scanning the faces of the recruits. Tempest Arrow wasn't just a phrase. It was a call sign, a name earned, not given. She was range leader for the most advanced marksmanship program this Corps has ever run. Tempest Arrow was the unit that held a hill under live fire overseas when the rest of us thought the line was broken. The recruits shifted uneasily. Some looked at her differently now. Others avoided her gaze entirely. She didn't brag about it. She didn't wear it on her sleeve. "But you should know," he continued. his tone sharper now. That the name you laughed at, the person you dismissed, is someone whose trigger hand has saved lives you'll never even hear about. The words landed like rounds, steady and unrelenting. The recruits straightened instinctively, their earlier arrogance stripped bare. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She only reset her weapon on safe, slung it over her shoulder, and walked back to her spot in formation. Her silence said more than any speech ever could. But the gunnery sergeant wasn't finished. You think this range is about targets? It's not. It's about respect. It's about patience. And it's about remembering that the one you mock might be the only one standing between you and a folded flag someday. He let the words hang, heavy, before giving the order to continue. The shooting resumed, but the noise felt different now. Every crack of a rifle was followed by a quick glance toward her target, as if each recruit needed to confirm for themselves that what they'd seen was real. She didn't falter. Each grouping was tighter than the last. By the end of the cycle, the paper at her lane was torn through the center, so cleanly it looked like one long scar instead of separate shots. When the order to clear weapons was given, she did so calmly, methodically, the same way she'd begun. Around her, the recruits stood a little straighter, their earlier smirks replaced by something else, something close to respect, though they didn't yet know how to show it. The gunnery sergeant gathered the line. His voice carried authority, but beneath it was something rarer, reverence. Tempest Arrow, he said again, this time to the entire formation. Remember the name. You'll find it in the manuals if you know where to look. But more important than the story is the lesson. Respect is earned long before you recognize it. And if you're smart, you'll learn to see it before someone has to spell it out for you. No one spoke. The recruits held still, their eyes forward, but the weight in the air told a different story. Something had shifted. Something they couldn't take back. She stood among them quietly, not asking for their acknowledgement, not demanding their attention. She had lived through worse than their jokes. She had carried names and memories heavier than any of them could imagine. The gunnery sergeant had given them a glimpse of that truth, but only a glimpse. Because the real story, the one that still echoed in her bones, hadn't been told yet. And before this day was done, they would see more than perfect groupings and a call sign. They would see why the name Tempest Arrow carried the kind of silence that spoke louder than any metal. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the range, the recruits began to understand what it meant to stand beside someone whose history you didn't know. She wasn't just another shooter. She was a reminder. And reminders have a way of changing everything. She didn't ask for recognition when the range went quiet. She didn't step forward to claim the title the gunnery sergeant had spoken aloud. She did what she had always done, shouldered her rifle, adjusted her gear, and stood in the silence while everyone else tried to figure out what it meant. But by the time the sun had sunk lower, painting the range in gold and shadow, the recruits knew this wasn't about drills anymore. Something deeper had entered the air, the kind of truth you don't read in manuals or hear in briefings. This was legacy walking among them, disguised in a young woman's quiet discipline. And they were finally beginning to see it. When the sergeant dismissed the line, the chatter didn't return. Usually, recruits spilled noise into the air the moment the command ended. Boasts about groupings, complaints about heat, nervous jokes. Not this time. They stood straighter, quieter, watching her as though hoping for some clue, some explanation that might fit what they'd just witnessed. She gave them none. She moved with calm precision, breaking down her weapon, stowing her gear, every motion deliberate, unhurried. To her, the moment was over. To them, it had just begun. One of the loudest recruits finally found his voice, though softer now. "Sergeant, what exactly was Tempest Arrow?" The gunnery sergeant's jaw worked as he studied the horizon, as if deciding how much truth to give them. Finally, he turned back, his eyes steady. Tempest Arrow was a call sign for a program most of you will never read about. Classified exercises, joint operations, situations where seconds mattered and the wrong breath cost lives. She wasn't just in that program, she led it. Range leader. That means when rounds were live, when chaos was breaking loose, when the rest of us thought the line would fold, she was the one keeping it steady. A ripple moved through the recruits. None dared laugh now. The cocky smirks were gone. In their place, unease and awe. They looked at her differently, as if trying to reconcile the quiet figure beside them with the storm the sergeant had just described. But she gave no confirmation. No nod. No smirk of pride. She simply strapped her pack, shouldered her rifle, and walked toward the gate. The silence followed her like a shadow. That evening, the recruits gathered in the barracks, restless, still buzzing with the day's revelation. Stories spun quickly in places like this. One swore she'd hit 10 bullseyes in a row. Another claimed the sergeant's voice had cracked when he said her call sign. Someone even suggested she'd been part of operations overseas no one was supposed to mention aloud. And in the corner, one recruit whispered the word they'd all been avoiding: hero. The gunnery sergeant overheard it. He stepped into the room, his presence cutting through the noise. "Don't call her that," he said firmly. "She doesn't need your labels. She doesn't carry this for applause." The room went still. The sergeant leaned on the doorframe, his eyes sharp. "What she showed you today isn't about medals or stories. It's about discipline. About carrying a name even when no one believes it anymore. You mocked her because you didn't know who she was. But that's the point. Out there, in the real fight, you'll never know who's beside you until the moment comes. And if you're lucky, you'll have someone like her there when it does." He didn't wait for questions. He left them with silence, the kind that weighed more than answers. Later that night, she sat alone at the edge of the barracks grounds, her rifle disassembled on a cloth, the last of the sunset reflecting in the metal. The gunnery sergeant approached quietly, his steps measured. "You never wanted them to know, did you?" he asked. She shook her head once, her eyes still on the weapon. "Names don't matter. Only results." "Maybe," he said, lowering himself onto the bench beside her. "But sometimes names remind the rest of us what results look like." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her silence had carried her through worse storms than this. The following morning, a subtle shift rippled across the base. Recruits who had ignored her now stepped aside respectfully. Some offered quick nods. One even saluted, clumsy but sincere. They whispered less. They watched more. And though she never asked for it, the air around her had changed. By week's end, the story had reached beyond the range. Instructors spoke of the drill where Tempest Arrow had fired flawless groupings, where the gunnery sergeant had named her aloud. Rumors flew, half-truths tangled with reverence. But beneath it all was a lesson none could shake. She was more than they had believed, and she had never needed to prove it. On the final day of training, before the recruits rotated out, the gunnery sergeant called them together. He held up a folded slip of paper, worn at the edges. "This," he said, "was written years ago, after one of those missions you'll never read about. It's not a citation, not a medal, just a note, signed by a general. It says, 'Tempest Arrow stood when the line broke. Range leader. The hill held because she refused to fall.'" The recruits stood frozen, their eyes on her. She didn't step forward. She didn't reach for the paper. She let the sergeant fold it again and tuck it back into his pocket. Because she didn't need the note to know what she carried. The sergeant dismissed them, and as they broke formation, one by one, the recruits turned toward her, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with respect. Silent, weighty, overdue respect. She rose, slung her rifle, and walked past them without a word. And in that silence, the recruits finally understood what the sergeant had been trying to teach all along. Respect isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It lives in the moments when someone chooses to stand firm, no matter who's watching, no matter who laughs. She was Tempest Arrow, range leader. Not a nickname, not a rumor, a reminder. And reminders, once spoken aloud, never fade again.